Hi, Roy Williams with Airframe Components, and today we have a special episode. We've got a special project in here we've been working on for the last few weeks. This is a 1959 Cessna 150. We're going to do a complete restoration on the whole aircraft. Today I have with me the owner of the aircraft, Mr. Phil Allison. Phil, why don't you give us a little history of the aircraft here and why it's so special to you to be restoring this aircraft?
This airplane is a 1959 Cessna 150, as Roy said, and that's the first year that they produced the 150 model. In 1961, my father learned to fly at the old Auburn Airport, which is now Reiki Park in Auburn. And after he got his license, he decided to buy the airplane that he learned in. And when he bought it with the understanding that they would teach me to fly in it. So in 1962, I got my license in this airplane. And at that point, my father decided he wanted a 172, which is a very similar airplane, only 4 passengers. So he sold this and moved into 172, and then over the course of the next several years had quite a variety of airplanes.
So in 61, 62, how old would you have been then?
Okay, I learned to fly when I was 16, actually 15. You could then.
Okay,
you can't
all
do
right.
that anymore.
And then, so your dad and you only had this airplane about a year, 2 years maybe?
About a year and a half.
Okay.
And, yeah, I had my pilot's license for it before I had my driver's license.
So the airplane was sold in 62. In doing your research, do you know where the aircraft went from here and where it spent most of its life?
Of course, my father bought it from the Eisters at the Angola airport, and then when he bought the 172, it went back to the Eisters briefly. They sold it to somebody, I believe it was in Coldwater, Michigan, and then I've got the complete ownership records of it, but it bounced around a couple small airports in the Chicago area, 2 or 3 airports in Michigan. I think the farthest that got away from here was Mount Pleasant, and then after that it was sold to a man in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, and he bought it in 1976, I believe. I'd have to look for sure. And he had the airplane up until the time I bought it.
So when did you get the idea of, hey, let's track this airplane down, let's buy the aircraft? About what time frame would that have been?
Okay, it was about 4 years ago. I was finishing up another restoration project that I was doing on a Stearman, and I have a little solo, not trophy, but a thing commemorating my solo, and it had the date and the end number of the airplane on it, and I saw that and I got thinking, wonder whatever happened to that airplane. So I traced it down through the FAA website, found it in Wilkes-Barre, and contacted the gentleman, and the airplane hadn't flown in 30 years. And he had dismantled it and just had it in storage.
And at what date, any idea when he dismantled it? You say it hadn't flown for 30 years, but...
Yeah, so it would have been in the early 70s. I think it was the early 70s, and I probably misspoke when I said he acquired it. I think he acquired it in the late 60s.
So it's been dismantled since... The late 70s. Yes. Really? Okay, so the aircraft was all apart. Describe how you found the aircraft when you went to go see it, as far as how it was stored.
Well, he had the wings stored at his house. He had evidently, when he made the decision to quit flying the airplane, he also didn't want to pay hangar rent on it. So he pulled the wings off of it and put the airplane in his backyard. And he had it there for maybe 4 or 5 years. And the neighbors complained, and evidently he had broken some ordinance and wasn't allowed to have it there. When the airplane was dismantled, he stored the wings underneath his pool deck, and they were wrapped in visqueen, which is probably worst scenario for storing aluminum there is, between trapping the moisture and then the chlorine content in the air around the pool and so on. And then the fuselage was out at this little airport north of Wilkes-Barre, and so when I got there, we went to his house first. He showed me the wings, and I almost left without the airplane. The man who was with me said, "Now you gotta go through with it," so we did. The owner had an appointment someplace, doctor's appointment or something, so he gave us directions to the airport, and we went out there and looking around, and finally we noticed the tail of a 150 sticking out of just a shade hanger. And this airplane had been pushed in there, and only about half of it was under cover. And we got out of the car and we're looking at it and so on. And this older gentleman came over and asked what we were doing. He said, "Well, we were looking at this plane." He said, "Do you own it?" And I said, "Well, not yet, but maybe later today." He says, "Well, that's interesting." He said, "That plane's been here for years and I never knew who owned it." And I says, "What?" He says, "No." He said, "It just showed up." He said, "Came to work Monday morning and evidently somebody brought it out here on Sunday. And I just shoved it off into the corner and then never heard from the owner." And this had gone on for years, and he was tickled to death that we were there, hopefully going to take it with us. So kind of bizarre.
So it had taken up rent there without paying rent, just store it there gratis, apparently.
Yeah, and and the man didn't want anything for it. He just, for the rent, he
glad
just
to get rid of it. Well, good.
But this was an interesting airport. It was this was back when they were aerodromes. And they had more neat old stuff around there and so on. It was a pretty neat experience getting it.
So Phil went through with the purchase, bought the airplane, and apparently it was already dismantled pretty much, so it was pretty easy to trailer back home.
The thing we had to do was take the horizontal stabilizer off of it to narrow it up, and I had gotten all the dimensions of the airplane out of the books that I had on it. And so I built a special deal on the airplane, so it would just roll on, strap it down, and then had pockets on the sides of the trailer to drop the wings in. And pretty successful adventure on getting it hauled back. Didn't have any problems.
So now when you found the aircraft, it had been painted at some point in its life, and when you flew this aircraft back in '61, you remember it being bare metal, with just a trim stripe down the side. Is that correct?
Raw aluminum with just a orangish red trim on it. And in my opinion, there's nothing prettier than a polished aluminum airplane. However, on the other hand, there's nothing harder to maintain than a polished aluminum airplane, but I'm looking forward to putting it back the way it was.
So you recall this aircraft when you were flying it in '61 as being bare metal with just a red trim stripe down the side. When you got the aircraft from Pennsylvania, it had been painted, obviously in some sort of amateur way, and so you brought it back here to Indiana and started stripping the paint and getting the aircraft dismantled.
There had been not only the paint, they had changed the wheels on it at the time, gone with bigger wheels. I'm going to try to go back and restore it as original as I can, as it would have been delivered in 1959. Even the instruments that were in it, I'm trying to reuse those and get them rebuilt. The exceptions will be that there's, of course, been communications and radio equipment that is the biggest difference that we'll have to put in to comply with the current regulations. But hopefully, in not too distant future, we'll have it airworthy and flying again, and hopefully teach my grandkids in it.
And Phil mentioned a previous restoration project. He has a Boeing Stearman biplane that he'd restored. Took a 7-year chunk of time to restore that aircraft. So when Phil approached us to help restore this aircraft, knowing the detail that went into that Stearman biplane, I knew that we would have to step up to be able to meet his standards. So I appreciate the history on the aircraft here, Phil. If you would, stay tuned for future episodes on the progress of this restoration project on this 1959 Cessna 150.